He said I was speeding before he even looked at my license. The words hung in the air like something unfinished, as Officer Ryan Mitchell stood beside a black sedan idling under the glow of a flickering traffic light at the intersection of Westlake Avenue and Monroe Street in downtown Chicago. It was just after 9:30 p.m., the kind of hour when the city felt half asleep but still watching everything through reflective glass and distant headlights. Inside the vehicle, Marcus Carter kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, steady and still, his delivery bag resting on the passenger seat with a half-empty water bottle rolling gently against it every time the engine idled. Marcus had been on the road since 6 a.m., completing stops across the city for a logistics company that paid by the route, not the hour, and his eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned to stay patient even when patience didn't seem to return the favor. Officer Mitchell, standing slightly angled toward the driver's window, held the posture of someone used to being obeyed without question, his flashlight resting low at his side as he glanced between Marcus and the dark interior of the car. "License and registration," he said flatly, not raising his voice, but not lowering it either. Marcus nodded once, calm, reaching slowly into the glove compartment, every movement deliberate and visible. "I understand, officer," Marcus replied evenly, placing the documents on the dashboard rather than handing them out directly, careful not to make any sudden motions that could be misread. Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in a kind of prejudgment that often came before explanation had a chance to exist. The street behind them remained quiet, a single taxi passing slowly on the opposite lane while a distant train horn echoed somewhere beyond the overpass. Marcus stayed composed, his voice steady as he added, "I just want to make sure everything is clear. I haven't been speeding. I came straight from Madison Avenue after my last drop-off." The officer did not respond immediately, instead circling half a step closer to the rear of the vehicle, scanning the plates, then the dashboard, then Marcus again as if aligning details in his mind before the facts had fully arrived. Inside the car, Marcus could feel the weight of being observed more than being heard, a familiar tension he had learned to navigate over the years without letting it change his tone or his posture. The air between them thickened with silence, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that made even passing headlights feel louder than they were. And then Officer Mitchell spoke again, softer this time, but sharper in meaning. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus didn't move at first, not out of defiance, but out of hesitation, as if trying to understand whether the moment had truly shifted or if there was still room for it to remain what it had been seconds earlier. Marcus Carter stayed still for a moment longer, not because he was refusing to comply, but because his mind was trying to catch up with how quickly the atmosphere had shifted from routine to something heavier, something less defined and harder to name. Outside the car, the street light above flickered again, casting uneven shadows across Officer Ryan Mitchell's uniform as he repeated the instruction with the same controlled tone, "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus exhaled slowly, then unbuckled his seatbelt with both hands visible, moving deliberately as he opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, his delivery uniform slightly wrinkled from a full day of work. The night air felt cooler outside the car, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint sound of footsteps from a pedestrian on the far corner who quickly slowed after noticing the scene unfolding. Marcus kept his hands relaxed at his sides, eyes forward, voice calm as he spoke again, "Officer, I want to cooperate fully. I just want to understand what I did wrong." Mitchell did not answer immediately, instead looking Marcus up and down in a way that suggested he was comparing what he saw with what he had already decided. "You were driving inconsistent speed," Mitchell finally said, his tone steady but firm, as if the conclusion had already been made and the explanation was only a formality. Marcus nodded once, not arguing, only responding. "I understand what you are saying, but my route tracker shows I have been maintaining the posted limit all evening. I can show you if needed." For a brief moment, there was only silence between them, interrupted only by the distant sound of a passing bus and the soft crackle of the police radio mounted on Mitchell's shoulder. The officer shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, then glanced toward the dashboard where Marcus's phone still displayed a delivery application tracking completed stops across the city. Behind them, a second vehicle slowed as it approached the intersection, its driver watching carefully before continuing through when instructed by a hand gesture from Mitchell. Marcus remained composed, though the tension in the moment was becoming more noticeable, not in any dramatic way, but in the kind of stillness that makes people aware of their own breathing. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back for a moment," Mitchell said suddenly, his voice still controlled, still measured, but carrying a finality that changed the air again. Marcus hesitated, not resisting, but clearly processing the instruction, then slowly complied, turning with his movements visible and unhurried, his voice low as he said, "Officer, I am not trying to cause any trouble. I am only trying to understand." The words did not change Mitchell's expression, but something in the background shifted as a passing car slowed just enough for its driver to take out a phone and begin recording from a distance. The night seemed to tighten around the intersection, not with chaos, but with attention, as if the entire block had become aware that something ordinary had turned uncertain. Marcus stood still, breathing evenly, waiting for what would come next while the officer's radio crackled again with an update that neither of them immediately reacted to. The crackle from the police radio lingered in the air for a moment after the initial burst of static, but neither Marcus Carter nor Officer Ryan Mitchell immediately reacted to it, as if both were still holding on to the version of reality that had already started to shift in different directions. Marcus remained standing with his hands visible behind his back, posture steady but alert, his eyes occasionally glancing toward the intersection where passing headlights painted brief streaks of light across the asphalt. Officer Mitchell adjusted the position of his radio, pressing it slightly closer to his shoulder before responding in a short, clipped acknowledgement that suggested routine communication rather than urgency. For Marcus, time felt unusually stretched, not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet awareness that every second was being observed by someone, somewhere, even if he could not yet see who that was. A second patrol vehicle arrived at the far end of the intersection within moments, slowing to a controlled stop with its lights reflecting off nearby storefront windows, adding another layer of attention to the already concentrated scene. From inside that vehicle, a second officer stepped out, his movements slower, more observational, as he approached with a brief glance at both Marcus and Officer Mitchell. "Everything okay here?" the second officer asked, voice neutral but attentive, as he looked between them and then toward the dash of Marcus's vehicle. Mitchell responded quickly, explaining his initial observation regarding inconsistent speed, while Marcus remained silent for the moment, waiting for the appropriate time to speak rather than interrupting the exchange already in progress. The second officer listened carefully, then shifted his focus toward Marcus, studying the situation with a more measured expression, as if evaluating not just the claim but the context around it. Marcus finally spoke again, maintaining the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Officer, I understand the concern. I would like to request that the vehicle tracking data be reviewed. My employer uses a digital route system that records speed and stops automatically." There was no challenge in his voice, only clarity, and that distinction seemed to register in the subtle pause that followed. Officer Mitchell looked briefly toward the second officer, then back at Marcus, his expression tightening slightly as if reassessing details that had previously felt certain. The second officer reached toward the dashboard area, noticing the active delivery application still displaying route history and timestamps. "That system logs speed in real time?" he asked, more to confirm than to challenge. Marcus nodded once and replied, "Yes, it records location and speed data continuously during active delivery routes." The wind picked up slightly at the corner of the street, causing a loose piece of paper near the curb to slide slowly across the pavement, breaking the stillness for just a moment before settling again. Behind them, the sound of another vehicle passing at a safe distance added a reminder that the rest of the city continued moving normally, even as this single intersection remained paused in attention. Officer Mitchell's posture shifted subtly, not in retreat, but in reconsideration, as he reached for his radio again, this time requesting verification of the speed data from the dispatch system connected to the department's traffic monitoring database. Marcus did not move, did not speak further, and instead simply waited, his focus steady, as the situation transitioned from immediate judgment toward procedural confirmation, leaving the outcome still unresolved but no longer based solely on assumption. The moment Officer Ryan Mitchell requested verification from the department system, the entire intersection seemed to settle into a different kind of silence, one that was not driven by tension alone but by the expectation of information arriving that could change the direction of everything that had already unfolded. Marcus Carter remained in the same position near the rear side of his vehicle, hands still visible, shoulders steady, his breathing controlled in a way that suggested experience with stressful situations that could not always be predicted or avoided. The second officer stood slightly to the side, observing both Marcus and Mitchell while keeping his attention divided between the unfolding procedure and the quiet flow of traffic that continued to pass at a distance. Inside the patrol vehicle, the radio channel shifted briefly as dispatch began retrieving data tied to the license plate and the active delivery route connected to Marcus's employer. System. The waiting period stretched only a few moments, but within that short span, the atmosphere changed from assumption to verification, from immediate reaction to structured review. Marcus glanced once toward the glowing dashboard of his own car, where the delivery application still displayed real-time tracking information, including timestamps that aligned with his entire route across the city that evening. Officer Mitchell kept his eyes forward, expression controlled but noticeably more restrained than before, as if the incoming confirmation had already begun to influence his expectations even before it fully arrived. A faint breeze moved through the intersection again, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the soft flicker of neon signage from a nearby closed storefront, adding subtle motion to a scene that otherwise felt suspended. When the radio finally crackled again, both officers focused immediately on the response from dispatch, which confirmed that the vehicle data being reviewed did not show any recorded speeding violations along the monitored route segments during the time in question. There was a brief pause after the transmission ended, long enough for the meaning of the information to settle without interruption. Officer Mitchell lowered his gaze slightly toward the ground for a moment, then shifted his stance, as if recalibrating the situation internally based on the new data. The second officer looked toward the dashboard again, then toward Marcus, and finally back at Mitchell, his expression neutral but attentive, reflecting the procedural clarity that had now replaced uncertainty. Marcus did not speak, choosing instead to maintain the same calm posture he had held since the beginning, allowing the information to stand on its own without adding pressure or commentary. The sound of passing tires on wet pavement echoed faintly from a car that moved through the far lane, briefly reflecting light across the lower panels of the patrol vehicle. Officer Mitchell finally spoke, his voice lower than before, steady but noticeably less firm in its earlier certainty, acknowledging the confirmation from dispatch while reframing the situation in procedural terms. The second officer stepped slightly closer, not interrupting but signaling readiness to proceed according to protocol now that the preliminary concern had been addressed. Marcus slowly lowered his hands from the behind-the-back position at the instruction of the officers, his movements still controlled and deliberate, showing no urgency, only compliance with the updated direction of the interaction. The tension that had defined the earlier moments of the stop began to shift into something more administrative, less uncertain, as the officers transitioned from enforcement posture to resolution review. The street around them remained active but indifferent, continuing its normal rhythm while the focus at the intersection gradually moved toward closure of the stop rather than escalation. Marcus Carter stood quietly near the rear of his vehicle as the weight of the moment slowly began to shift from uncertainty into something closer to resolution, though the air still carried the residue of tension that had built up earlier in the stop. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained near the patrol unit for a brief moment longer, processing the confirmation from dispatch, his posture no longer rigid with presumption but not yet fully relaxed into closure. The second officer maintained his position slightly to the side, observing both men with the calm attention of someone ensuring procedure was properly followed after an unexpected deviation. The intersection around them continued to function as normal, with distant engines passing through green lights and reflections sliding across the damp surface of the road, creating a contrast between ordinary city movement and the stillness of the scene itself. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly, lowering his shoulders in a subtle release of tension that had been held for several minutes, his voice calm as he spoke only when addressed, maintaining a respectful distance from escalation or interpretation. Officer Mitchell finally stepped forward, returning to Marcus with a more measured expression, acknowledging the verified data and the absence of any recorded violation, his tone now aligned with procedural acknowledgement rather than suspicion. "All right," Mitchell said evenly, pausing briefly as if choosing words carefully. "The system confirms no speeding violation during the route in question." The second officer nodded once, accepting the confirmation without additional commentary, signaling that the matter had transitioned into closure protocol. Marcus gave a slight nod in response, not expressive beyond what was necessary, simply acknowledging the statement without attempting to extend the moment further than required. A short silence followed, not tense this time, but administrative in nature, the kind that often appears when an incident moves from active evaluation into resolution. Mitchell took a half step back, glancing briefly toward Marcus's vehicle, then toward the intersection, as if mentally reviewing whether anything else remained unresolved within standard procedure. The second officer shifted his attention toward Marcus, then spoke briefly, informing him that he was free to continue his route and that no further action would be required at this time. Marcus responded with a simple acknowledgement, maintaining the same calm tone he had carried throughout the encounter, then slowly turned toward his vehicle, ensuring his movements remained visible and unhurried as he re-entered the driver's side. Inside the car, the familiar interior felt different for a moment, not because anything had physically changed, but because the pressure that had been present earlier was no longer pressing against the edges of the experience. Outside, Officer Mitchell remained near the patrol unit, his expression composed but reflective, as if the sequence of events had added a layer of consideration beyond the immediate stop itself. The second officer returned to his vehicle, preparing to depart as well, while the intersection gradually resumed its normal rhythm of movement and sound. Marcus started the engine again, the dashboard lights illuminating his face with a soft glow as he reoriented himself toward the rest of his delivery route, the city continuing forward around him as if the moment at the intersection had already begun to recede into the larger flow of the night. As Marcus Carter drove away from the intersection, the city around him slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, with traffic lights cycling through their steady patterns and storefront reflections stretching across the windshield as he merged back into the flow of late evening streets. The silence inside his vehicle felt different now, not heavy with uncertainty but softened by resolution, as if the space itself had exhaled after holding tension for too long. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, maintaining control out of habit rather than necessity, while his eyes stayed focused on the road ahead that curved gently through downtown Chicago. The delivery application on his dashboard updated automatically, redirecting him to his next destination, and the system voice confirmed the address with calm precision, adding a sense of structure back into his evening after the disruption that had briefly interrupted it. Marcus adjusted the temperature control slightly, not because he was uncomfortable, but because he needed something small and physical to anchor himself back into routine. Outside, the city lights reflected off passing windows, creating brief patterns of brightness that appeared and disappeared in seconds, like fragments of thought moving across his mind. He replayed the sequence of events not with emotional intensity, but with the quiet analytical awareness of someone who had experienced similar moments before, where perception and verification had not initially aligned. There was no anger in his expression, only a steady awareness of how quickly assumptions could form and how equally important it was for facts to eventually take their place. As he continued driving, the memory of Officer Mitchell's posture at the end of the stop remained present, not as conflict, but as a reminder of how attention and interpretation can shift once information becomes complete. Marcus turned onto a wider avenue, the street opening into multiple lanes lined with evenly spaced streetlights that cast consistent pools of illumination onto the asphalt. A light breeze moved through the city corridor, causing faint movement in roadside trees and adding subtle motion to an otherwise structured environment. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of the evening settle into perspective, recognizing it as one of many encounters that shaped the unpredictability of working life on the road, where every interaction carried the possibility of misunderstanding and resolution existing within the same timeline. Meanwhile, back at the intersection, Officer Mitchell remained near his patrol vehicle for a brief period after Marcus had left, his gaze following the direction of traffic before eventually shifting downward as if reviewing the sequence of decisions that had taken place. The second officer had already begun to depart, his vehicle merging back into the stream of city patrol routes, leaving Mitchell momentarily alone with the stillness of the location. The traffic lights continued their cycle without interruption, and pedestrians resumed their movement along sidewalks that had briefly slowed their pace during the earlier interaction. Mitchell finally turned toward his vehicle, his expression composed but reflective, as he entered the driver's seat and prepared to continue his shift. The radio inside the car remained active, carrying distant dispatch communications that blended into the background of routine city monitoring. As he drove away from the intersection in the opposite direction of Marcus's route, the scene gradually returned to its neutral state, leaving behind only the ordinary sounds of a city that continued to move forward without pause, carrying both individuals back into their separate paths within the same unfolding night. Marcus Carter continued driving through the widening streets of downtown Chicago as the city transitioned deeper into the night, the glow of storefront lights and overhead traffic signals creating a steady rhythm that matched the controlled pace of his thoughts. His delivery route had updated again, confirming 2 remaining stops before the end of his shift, and the navigation system projected an estimated completion time that felt normal compared to the earlier disruption at the intersection. Inside the vehicle, the quiet return to routine carried a subtle contrast against what had happened only a short time ago, not because the situation had escalated, but because it had briefly paused his entire evening before releasing it back into motion. Marcus kept his attention on the road, but his phone, mounted beside the dashboard, displayed a new notification from the logistics system, indicating that his route performance had been logged without any flagged incidents or compliance issues. The confirmation itself was simple, yet it reinforced a sense of closure that extended beyond the immediate stop, as if the entire sequence had been absorbed into a larger system that evaluated outcomes without emotional interpretation. At the same time, across the city at a district communications center, archived body camera data from multiple patrol units was automatically syncing to a centralized review system, as part of standard procedural logging that captured all traffic stops for quality assurance and accountability review. Officer Ryan Mitchell, now back in his patrol route, received a brief notification on his in-car terminal indicating that the incident involving Marcus Carter had been formally closed with no violations confirmed and no further action required. He glanced at the screen briefly, his expression controlled, but the acknowledgement of the report carried a subtle weight that suggested reflection rather than conclusion. The second officer, who had been present at the intersection earlier, was already several blocks away responding to another routine call, unaware that footage from a civilian dashboard camera positioned behind Marcus's vehicle had automatically uploaded to a public traffic monitoring platform used by commuters for real-time road updates. Within minutes, that footage began circulating through local community feeds, showing the full sequence of the stop from a neutral external angle, capturing Marcus's calm compliance, the measured communication between officers, and the gradual shift from initial assumption to procedural verification. The video did not include commentary, only visual context, but that alone was enough for viewers to interpret the contrast between perception and outcome in ways that extended beyond the immediate moment. Meanwhile, Marcus remained unaware of the broader circulation as he arrived at his next delivery stop, stepping out of his vehicle with the same steady pace he had maintained throughout the evening, completing the handoff of the package with brief, professional acknowledgement from the recipient. Back in his vehicle moments later, he noticed a new message from his employer's system indicating appreciation for his continued professionalism during a recorded traffic interaction, noting that all procedures had been followed correctly and that no disruptions to service metrics had occurred. Marcus read the message briefly, then set the phone back into its holder, returning his focus to the road ahead without lingering on the acknowledgement. In another part of the city, Officer Mitchell reviewed a short internal summary report on his terminal, which noted that the initial concern had been resolved without citation, and while the language remained formal and procedural, his eyes lingered for a moment longer than necessary before he resumed patrol duties. The night continued forward for all involved, each returning to their respective roles within the city's constant motion, yet the events of the intersection had already been recorded, processed, and quietly absorbed into the larger system of accountability, leaving behind a subtle but lasting awareness that every moment observed could carry more weight once fully understood. Later that night, Marcus Carter found himself driving through a quieter stretch of Chicago where the buildings were spaced farther apart and the glow of streetlights became more isolated, creating long shadows that moved slowly across the asphalt as his vehicle passed through each section of road. His final delivery of the evening had been completed without issue, and the system had already marked his route as successfully finished, yet his mind remained in a neutral state of observation rather than emotional reflection, as if the events earlier in the night had been filed away into a separate mental space reserved for situations that required attention but not reaction. The radio inside his vehicle played faint background updates from the logistics network, but there were no alerts directed toward him, only routine confirmations of completed routes from other drivers scattered across the city. As he approached a red light at an empty intersection, Marcus slowed to a stop and allowed the vehicle to idle, his eyes briefly shifting toward the side mirror where the empty street behind him reflected only distant headlights. In that moment of stillness, his phone vibrated once, displaying a notification that was not from his employer but from a community traffic monitoring application where drivers occasionally shared road conditions and incident footage for public awareness. The preview of the message showed a short clip from earlier in the night at the intersection on West Lake Avenue and Monroe Street, labeled simply as a routine traffic stop recording. Marcus did not open it immediately, instead watching the traffic light cycle from red to green before continuing forward, maintaining his focus on the road. A few blocks later, parked near a curb outside a closed convenience store, he finally stopped the vehicle and took a moment to review the notification more carefully. The video showed the earlier scene from a wider perspective, capturing not only his interaction with Officer Ryan Mitchell but also the presence of the 2nd Patrol Unit and the gradual shift from initial assumption to confirmed verification. Marcus watched without expression, his attention steady, noticing details that had not been visible from inside the vehicle, including the way the officer's posture changed once the system data had been confirmed. There was no commentary attached to the footage, only the visual record itself, but the absence of interpretation made the sequence feel more structured, as if the moment had been preserved exactly as it occurred without distortion. After a few seconds, Marcus closed the video and set the phone back into its holder, exhaling slowly as he leaned slightly back into the driver's seat. Across town, in a quiet patrol sector, Officer Ryan Mitchell reviewed a similar internal reference clip on his department-issued terminal, observing the same sequence from a different angle, his expression controlled but noticeably more reflective than earlier in the night. The system had already marked the incident as closed, but the recorded footage remained accessible for review, allowing procedural transparency to extend beyond immediate resolution. Mitchell did not speak, only observing, his eyes following the sequence until the moment confirmation had been received and the interaction had shifted from assumption to verification. He eventually turned the screen off and returned his focus to patrol duties, merging back into the routine rhythm of the city. Meanwhile, Marcus restarted his vehicle and continued forward, the road ahead open and steady, carrying him into the final stretch of his night as the city around him maintained its constant flow of movement, unaware that a single recorded moment was now circulating quietly through multiple systems of observation, review, and memory, each preserving the same event in slightly different ways while the people involved continued forward without pause. The final stretch of Marcus Carter's night unfolded under a quieter section of Chicago where the streets widened and the density of buildings began to thin, leaving more open space between pools of light cast by evenly spaced street lamps. His vehicle moved steadily through the lanes with the same controlled rhythm he had maintained since leaving the earlier incident behind, each mile bringing him closer to the end of a long work shift that had started before sunrise. Inside the car, the environment felt familiar again, no longer shaped by interruption or external scrutiny, but by the routine patterns of navigation, delivery schedules, and distance markers that defined his daily work. The system on his dashboard confirmed that all assigned stops had been completed successfully, marking the route as closed and updating his status to inactive for further deliveries until the next cycle. Marcus kept both hands lightly on the steering wheel, eyes forward, posture relaxed in a way that only appeared after extended focus had finally released its hold. Outside, the city remained active in fragments, with occasional passing vehicles creating brief streams of light that reflected across his windshield before disappearing into the distance. As he approached a quieter residential stretch, he reduced speed and eventually pulled into a small rest area near a public park, where a few parked cars sat spaced apart under dim lighting. He turned off the engine and allowed the silence to settle fully inside the cabin, noticing how different it felt compared to earlier hours when every sound seemed tied to anticipation. A notification from his employer appeared on the dashboard interface, confirming payment processing for the completed shift and acknowledging that all route metrics, including timing and compliance, had been verified without discrepancy. Marcus read the message once, then set the device down, leaning back slightly in the seat as he allowed the information to register without reaction beyond quiet acknowledgement. At the same time, across the city in a departmental review environment, the recorded footage from the earlier traffic stop had completed its standard classification cycle, becoming part of a routine archive used for oversight and procedural reference. Officer Ryan Mitchell, now off active patrol and seated briefly in a station briefing area, viewed a final summary note attached to the incident file, which confirmed that no violation had occurred and that the stop had concluded in full compliance with verification protocols. He did not speak while reading, only observing the document as it summarized the sequence of events in neutral language that stripped away interpretation and left only structured outcome. After a few moments, he closed the file and placed the terminal down, exhaling slowly as he shifted his attention toward the next assignment waiting in the queue, allowing the earlier event to settle into memory without further engagement. Marcus remained in his parked vehicle for a short time longer, looking out through the windshield at the calm movement of distant headlights beyond the park boundary, the night now fully returned to its ordinary state. There was no sense of escalation remaining, only the quiet continuity of a city that had processed a brief moment of misunderstanding and then moved forward without interruption. When Marcus finally restarted the engine, the sound felt softer than before, as if the entire evening had transitioned into its final phase. He guided the vehicle back onto the road, continuing toward home with steady focus, while behind him the city maintained its constant flow of motion, preserving the memory of the encounter only within systems of record and observation, leaving the individuals involved to carry on separately within the same unfolding night.